When my grandfather died, nobody talked about inheritance. There wasn't any money. There wasn't a house with a tin roof or a canoe with fresh caulking or even a decent machete worth passing down. What they talked about was the land. And they talked about it the way men talk about a debt nobody wants to claim. The funeral was held on a Wednesday in March of 1923, during the first hard rains of the wet season. I was 15 years old. The river had risen 2 feet overnight and turned the color of rust, and the men who gathered at the longhouse afterward stood in their wet clothes and spoke quietly about my grandfather's life as though they were trying to remember something they had already agreed to forget. My mother had died when I was 9. My father had gone upriver to work a rubber station when I was 11 and never came back. My grandfather had taken me in, but he was old by then and slow, and the other families looked at us the way you look at a leaking canoe, with pity and from a distance. "There's a patch of jungle he used to stay on," one of the men told me after the burial. His name was Aldo. He was my grandfather's second cousin, or third. Nobody kept close count. "Nothing there but a fallen tree and mud. If you want it, it's yours." He said it like a joke. The other men smiled. One of them laughed under his breath, like it was the last thing anyone would choose. I didn't answer right away. I had learned by 15 that silence was cheaper than argument and lasted longer. I looked at Aldo's face and saw no cruelty in it, just the honest certainty that nothing good could come from a dead man's muddy hillside. "I'll go look at it," I said. "Suit yourself," Aldo said. "Take a machete. The trail's mostly gone." A few days later, I went to see it myself. The walk from the settlement took most of the morning. I left at first light, when the mist still clung to the river and the birds hadn't started their full noise yet. Just the early ones, the ones that sang before the sun cleared the ridge. I carried a machete, a woven bag with dried fish and a gourd of water, and a rolled sleeping mat tied across my back with a strip of bark cloth. The trail did exist, but barely. A crease in the undergrowth that my grandfather must have kept open with regular passing, and that had already begun to close since his legs gave out the previous dry season. I cut through hanging vines and stepped over roots thick as a man's thigh. The air was dense with moisture and alive with the high-pitched drone of insects I couldn't see. Twice I lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack, looking for the small nicks my grandfather had carved into the bark of certain trees, marks so old the wood had nearly grown over them, but still visible if you knew what to look for. The jungle changed as I climbed away from the river. The trees near the settlement were young. Second growth, 40 or 50 years old, thin-trunked and close, together, fighting for light. But as the ground rose and the soil turned from sandy alluvium to heavy red clay, the forest opened up. The trees here were ancient. Their trunks rose 80, 90 feet before the first branch, smooth and gray as stone columns, and their buttress roots spread across the forest floor like the walls of ruined buildings. The place was deep in the jungle, where the ground turned uneven and the trees grew older and wider. The canopy here was so thick that the light came through in thin shafts, catching the mist that hung between the trunks like gauze. The soil was dark and rich, and covered with a carpet of rotting leaves that compressed underfoot, with a sound like wet cloth being wrung. The air smelled of decay and growth at once, the sweet rot of dead wood breaking down, and the sharp green scent of new shoots pushing through it. It didn't take long to find the tree they were talking about. It was enormous. The trunk had fallen years ago, maybe a decade, maybe longer, ripping half the hillside open when it collapsed. The impact had carved a shallow trench down the slope and scattered broken branches across an area the size of a longhouse. The wood was gray and weathered on the outside, but where bark had peeled away, I could see that the heartwood was still dense and dark. This had been a tree that took 200 years to grow. Its roots stood upright, like a tangled wall of wood and earth, torn from the ground and frozen in the shape of their own uprooting. The root ball rose 12 or 13 feet above the slope, a disk of interlocked wood and compacted soil held together by 1,000 smaller roots woven tight as basket weave. Beneath it, where the roots had pulled free, a hollow space opened into the hillside. A cavity roughly 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and just tall enough for a man to sit upright. From a distance, it looked useless. Just a rotting tree and a hole in the ground. I almost turned around. The men's laughter was still fresh in my ears, and for a moment I believed what they believed, that this was nothing, that my grandfather had been a fool for spending time here, and that I was a fool for walking half a day to see it. But something my grandfather used to say came back to me then. He said it often, usually when I was impatient, usually when I wanted to understand something before I had finished looking at it. "Sit down and watch," he would say. "The jungle shows you everything, but only if you stay still long enough." So I stayed still. I sat on the fallen trunk and looked at the hollow beneath the roots for a long time. I watched the way the air moved. I watched where the water ran. I noticed how the massive root ball blocked the wind from 3 directions, north, west, and south, while the open face pointed east, away from the prevailing storms. I climbed down into the hollow and pressed my hand against the soil floor. It was compact and dry. The thick roots above formed a natural ceiling, and the earth packed around them was dense enough to hold without sagging. I looked up and studied the way the roots interlocked. They weren't random. They formed arches, natural beams, each one supported by the next, distributing the weight of the soil above them the way a bridge distributes the weight of a man crossing a river. It wasn't a hole. It was a shelter waiting to be built. That night I slept in the hollow, with nothing but a woven mat and a fire I built at the entrance to keep the animals back. Rain came after midnight, a sudden, hard rain that hammered the canopy above and sent water streaming down the hillside in thin brown rivers. I lay on my back and listened to the water rush past the root ball on either side, and I noticed something that changed everything. The water didn't come in. The root ball sat on the uphill side of the hollow like a dam. The water parted around it and ran downhill along the channels that the trees' collapse had carved years ago. Inside the hollow, the ground stayed dry. My grandfather had known. That was why he came here. Not because he was a fool, because he was watching. The next morning I began to work. I cleared loose soil and debris from the hollow with my hands and a flat stone I sharpened against a boulder. The floor underneath was hard laterite clay, the kind that sets almost like brick when it dries. I leveled it as best I could, scraping away the humps and filling the low spots with packed earth. Then I reinforced the sides. I cut hardwood stakes from a young ironwood tree I found 50 yards downhill and drove them into the clay along the walls of the hollow, angling them inward so they braced against the earth behind them. I lashed cross pieces between the stakes using strips of green bark from a liana vine, the kind that shrinks as it dries and tightens the joint better than any knot. The drainage came next. I dug a trench along the uphill edge of the root ball, 18 inches deep and a foot wide, angling it so that rainwater would be caught before it reached the hollow and channeled away to the east, where the slope dropped steeply toward a creek bed. I lined the bottom of the trench with flat stones to keep it from silting up, Every day I worked from first light until the heat became unbearable in the early afternoon, and then I rested until the shadows grew long, and I could work again until dark. I ate what I found: palm hearts, wild bananas, a species of river crab that lived under the stones in the creek below. I set snares for small game using techniques my grandfather had shown me. Simple loop traps tied to bent saplings, placed along the narrow runs between the roots of old trees where agoutis and pacas traveled at dusk. The jungle tested every mistake I made. My first drainage trench was too shallow. A storm came 6 days after I started, and the water overwhelmed the channel and poured across the lip of the hollow, soaking everything I had. I spent the next 2 days digging a second trench, deeper and wider, cutting it into the clay at a steeper angle so the water moved faster. I learned to read the hillside the way my grandfather must have read it, to see where the water wanted to go and to help it get there. Insects were the next problem. The hollow was sheltered and warm, which meant it was also attractive to mosquitoes, ants, and a species of biting fly that came out in clouds after every rain. I sealed the cracks between the roots and the earth walls with a mixture of wet clay and wood ash, packing it in with my fingers and smoothing it flat. For the mosquitoes, I built a small smudge fire each evening, using green leaves and damp wood that produced a thick white smoke. The smoke filled the upper part of the hollow and drove the insects out through the gaps in the root ceiling. After 2 weeks, I carved a narrow air shaft through the earth behind the roots, angling it upward so the smoke could draw out naturally. The airflow improved. The insects became manageable. Then I started carving deeper. The roots formed natural beams above me, horizontal members spaced 18 inches to 2 feet apart, each one as thick as my forearm or thicker. I used them as a framework. I wove green branches between them, bending each branch in an arc and wedging the ends into the gaps in the root structure. Over the branches, I packed a layer of clay mixed with chopped palm fiber, building it up an inch at a time and letting each layer dry before adding the next. The result was a ceiling that was solid enough to walk on and thick enough to keep the rain out. The walls I built the same way, woven branches, clay, and fiber, reinforced with vertical stakes driven into the floor. I left the east-facing opening as a doorway, framing it with 2 ironwood posts and hanging a curtain of woven palm leaves that I could tie open during the day and close at night. I built a raised, sleeping platform from split bamboo, lashing the pieces together and setting the frame on 4 short posts cut from the same ironwood. The platform stood 8 inches above the floor, enough to keep me off the cold clay and above any water that might seep in during the heaviest rains. I stuffed dried grass beneath a layer of palm leaves for a mattress. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry, and in the jungle, dry was everything. Weeks turned into months. The wet season deepened. Every problem forced me to rebuild something better. The clay walls cracked when they dried too fast, so I learned to keep them damp during the day and let them cure slowly. The palm leaf curtain rotted in less than a month, so I replaced it with a frame of woven bamboo strips coated in tree resin that repelled water and lasted through the season. My food cache attracted ants until I suspended it from a vine tied to a root beam and coated the vine with sticky sap from a breadfruit tree. The ants couldn't cross it. I kept a routine. Every morning I checked the drainage trenches and cleared any debris. I gathered food. I improved the shelter. I explored the jungle in widening circles around my camp, learning which trees fruited when, which streams ran clean in the dry season, and which ones silted up, where the game trails led and where the predators hunted. The jungle punished hurry, but it rewarded attention. One afternoon in May, a man from the settlement appeared on the trail below my camp. His name was Tomas. He was Aldo's son, a year older than me, and he had come, he said, to see if I was still alive. He stood at the edge of the hollow and looked at what I had built. He didn't say anything for a long time. "You live in here?" he asked. "Yes." He ducked his head under the doorway and stepped inside. I watched him look at the walls, the ceiling, the sleeping platform, the smoke-blackened air shaft. He pressed his hand against the clay wall the way I had pressed mine against the soil floor months earlier. "It's cool in here," he said, surprised. He was right. The earth walls and the root ceiling kept the interior 10 or 15 degrees cooler than the open air. The air shaft drew warm air out and pulled cooler air in from the shaded side of the root ball. I hadn't planned it that way. I had carved the shaft for smoke. But the effect was real, and on the hottest days it made the difference between misery and rest. "Your grandfather knew about this place," Tomas said. "It wasn't a question." "I think so. My father said he was stubborn, said he wasted his time up here." "Maybe." Tomas looked at me. Maybe he wasn't wasting it. After that, Tomas came back. Not every week, but often enough. He brought things I couldn't get in the jungle: salt, a steel file for sharpening my machete, a length of good rope. In return, I showed him what I had learned: how to read the water on the hillside, how to mix clay and fiber for walls that didn't crack, how to angle a drainage trench so it cleared itself. He was the first person since my grandfather who looked at what I did and saw something worth learning. The dry season came and went. I cleared a small garden on the east-facing slope below the root ball, burning the brush in a controlled fire that I ringed with stones and watched for 2 hours until it burned down to white ash. I turned the ash into the soil with a digging stick and planted manioc cuttings, sweet potato slips, and a few rows of maize that I got from Tomas in exchange for a bundle of palm fiber rope I had learned to braid. The soil was good. The rotting tree had been feeding it for years, dropping leaves and bark and sawdust that the fungi and beetles broke down into dark, crumbly earth. The slope caught the morning sun while the canopy shaded it from the worst of the afternoon heat. Within 6 weeks, the manioc had taken root, and the sweet potato vines were spreading across the cleared ground, their broad leaves trapping moisture and shading out the weeds. I learned the rhythms: plant in the dry season, harvest before the heavy rains, dry fish and meat when the sun was strong, and store it in clay pots sealed with beeswax. Keep the fire going, because a fire was more than warmth. It was light and insect control, and a way to purify water, and the one thing in the jungle that made you feel like you were something more than another animal hiding from the rain. I expanded the shelter. I dug a second chamber to the south, connecting it to the first, through a low passage carved between 2 of the larger roots. The ceiling in the passage was low. I had to crawl on hands and knees. But the second chamber was nearly as large as the first. I reinforced it the same way, with stakes and woven branches and clay. This room I used for storage: dried fish wrapped in palm leaves, smoked meat hung from the root beams on vine hooks, stacked firewood that I kept bone dry by sealing the walls tight and leaving a small air gap at the top for ventilation. I stored my clay pots there too, the ones I traded for at the river post, with bundles of medicinal bark I had learned to harvest from the trees uphill. A trader at the river post, an old Portuguese man named Ferreira, told me the bark was valuable. "Cinchona?" he said, turning a piece of it over in his hands. "Where did you find this?" "On the ridge above my camp. You know what this is good for?" "Fever," I said. My grandfather had told me that much. You boiled the bark and drank the water. It tasted like poison, but it brought a fever down. Ferreira looked at me for a long time. Boy, there are men in the cities who would pay good money for this bark. Real money. I didn't go to the cities, but I kept harvesting the bark, and Ferreira kept trading for it, and slowly I accumulated the things I needed: tools, cloth, a cooking pot, a tarpaulin, a proper knife with a bone handle. Then the big storm came. It arrived in November, at the peak of the wet season, when the ground was already saturated and the rivers were running high. The sky turned the color of iron 2 days before the rain started, and when it came all at once. A downpour so heavy that the air itself seemed to turn to water. Rain fell for 2 days without stopping. The creek below my camp became a river. The river below the settlement became a flood. I could hear trees falling in the distance, sharp cracks followed by long, groaning crashes that shook the ground under my feet. The ground on the hillside above the valley began to slide. It started slowly. A section of slope 200 yards above the settlement, where the forest had been cleared for planting, let go all at once. The topsoil, saturated with water and no longer held in place by roots, turned liquid and slid downhill, taking everything with it. Surface shelters, drying racks, garden plots, footpaths, all of it became part of a moving wall of mud and broken wood that poured into the valley like something alive. Water rushed downhill like a river. From inside my chamber, I could hear the earth moving. A deep, low sound, not like thunder, more like the ground itself was groaning. Soil shifted above the root ball. Small streams of muddy water found their way through cracks I thought I had sealed. I stuffed them with clay and rags and pressed my back against the wall and listened. If the roots above me shifted even a little, the entire hillside would collapse into the hollow. I sat in the dark, listening to the storm hammer the jungle above my head. I thought about leaving. I thought about climbing out and running downhill to the settlement, but I knew the slope was moving and the dark was absolute, and that a man on foot in a landslide was already dead. So I stayed. I stayed because the roots had held through every storm before this one. I stayed because the drainage trenches I had dug were still working. I could hear the water rushing through them, diverted away from the chamber, pouring down the hillside in the channels I had carved. I stayed because my grandfather had chosen this place, and he had been watching the jungle longer than anyone. The roots held. The massive tree that everyone called useless locked the soil together like a giant anchor in the earth. The root ball, 12 feet across and sunk deep into the laterite clay, gripped the hillside the way a hand grips a rope. The interlocked roots above my chamber held the soil in place, even as the ground around them shifted and slid. The weight of the tree trunk, still lying along the slope below, acted as a brace, a fallen beam that kept the earth from moving freely. By morning, the rain had eased to a drizzle. I climbed out of the chamber and stood on top of the root ball and looked downhill. Half the hillside had slid into the valley. The damage was worse than anything I had imagined from inside the chamber. A swath of jungle 200 yards wide had been stripped bare, the topsoil gone, the understory gone, even some of the smaller trees torn out and carried downhill in the flow. What remained was raw red clay, slick and gleaming in the gray morning light, scored with deep channels where the water had cut through. The settlement was buried under 3 feet of mud. The longhouse had shifted off its posts and leaned at an angle, its thatch roof sagging and torn. The drying racks were gone. The gardens were gone. The manioc plots, the banana stands, the papaya trees that had taken years to bear fruit, all of it smothered under a blanket of clay and broken wood. Most of the shelters built on the surface, the ones built on cleared ground, on soil with no roots to hold it, were piles of broken wood and mud scattered across the valley floor like toys a child had thrown. People were already picking through the wreckage, pulling out what they could save. Nobody had been killed, but nearly everything they had built was destroyed. The only place still standing was the chamber, hidden beneath the roots. I went back inside and gathered what I had: dried food, rope, the tarpaulin, my tools, the cooking pot. I carried it all downhill to the settlement and gave it to the families who had lost the most. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and it was something. Aldo found me that afternoon. He was covered in mud up to his waist, and his face looked 10 years older than it had the day before. "Your place," he said. "Still there?" "Still there." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is reconsidering something he was certain about. "Your grandfather," he said. He tried to tell us about those roots, about how the old trees hold the hill together. We thought he was just talking. He wasn't just talking. Aldo looked at me. No, I suppose he wasn't. In the months that followed, I helped rebuild what the storm had taken, but I didn't build the way they had built before. I showed them what the fallen tree had taught me, how roots hold soil, how drainage keeps a foundation dry, how clay and fiber make walls that last, how building with the shape of the land instead of against it is the difference between a shelter that stands and one that washes away. Tomas helped me. Together, we rebuilt 3 shelters using the techniques I had developed in my chamber. We dug proper drainage trenches. We set posts into laterite clay instead of topsoil. We angled roofs to shed water downhill and away from the walls. The next wet season, those shelters held. People noticed. Years passed. I married a girl named Lena who had come to the settlement from a mission school downriver. She was quiet and practical and had a way of looking at problems that reminded me of my grandfather, patient, methodical, never rushing to conclusions. She taught me to read properly, and I taught her to read the jungle. Together we expanded the chamber beneath the roots into a proper home. 3 connected rooms, a covered kitchen, a rainwater catchment system that collected water from the surface of the root ball and channeled it through a sand filter into a clay cistern. We raised 4 children in that house. Each of them learned to build. Each of them learned to watch. My eldest son, Gabriel, had my grandfather's patience and my mother's sharp eyes. He became a guide for the naturalists who began coming through the region in the 1940s, European and American men with pressed shirts and leather notebooks who wanted to catalog the jungle's plants and animals and birds. Gabriel led them along routes I had mapped over 20 years of walking, paths that followed ridgelines where the footing was sure, that crossed rivers at the shallow fords, that passed through groves where the rarest orchids grew. He earned good money, and he earned something better than money, the respect of men who studied the world for a living and who recognized in Gabriel's quiet knowledge the same careful observation that had built my home beneath the roots. My daughter, Anna, learned the medicinal plants, not just the cinchona bark, but dozens of others, the bark of the copaiba tree that healed cuts and burns, the leaves of the cat's claw vine that eased joint pain, the crushed seeds of the annatto that repelled insects better than any smoke. She kept a notebook of remedies, writing down each plant's name, its location, the season for harvesting, the method of preparation, and the ailments it treated. A doctor from Belém who passed through in 1952 spent 3 days reading Anna's notebook and later called it one of the most complete regional pharmacopoeias he had ever seen. He asked if he could copy it. Anna let him, on the condition that he credit the knowledge to the people who had discovered it, not to himself. My second son, Mateus, became a builder. My youngest, Clara, became a teacher at the mission school, downriver. Each of them carried something from the hillside into their lives, a way of looking at problems, a habit of patience, a belief that the answer was usually already there if you stayed still long enough to see it. I lived in the chamber beneath the roots for 51 years. The tree that everyone laughed at became the oldest shelter on the hillside. The roots never shifted. The clay walls I built as a boy of 15 were still standing when I was an old man, patched and reinforced 100 times, but still solid, still cool, still dry. They said my grandfather left me nothing, but he left me the strongest shelter on the hillside. He left me the knowledge that a fallen tree is not a dead thing. It is a foundation. He left me the habit of sitting still and watching until the jungle showed me what it wanted to show. I am writing this in the dry season of 1974. I am 66 years old. My hands are slower than they used to be, and my knees ache when the weather changes. But I still walk the trail to the root ball every morning. I still check the drainage trenches. I still press my hand against the clay wall and feel the coolness of the earth behind it. My grandchildren play in the hollow where I once slept alone, listening to a storm that could have killed me. They don't know what the place looked like before I built it. They don't know that men laughed when they gave it to me. And that is fine, because the shelter is still here. The roots are still holding. And nobody laughs at the fallen tree anymore.